Welcome back to the Hoopball YouTube channel. It is part 2 of our series breaking down the presumed top 100 players in the NBA for the fantasy basketball season coming up here. I'm Alan Strokey, joined once again by my good friend Harry Shedler. Got it. I knew I had
You'll get it. You'll get it. You'll get it. Hello, everyone.
As a man with a last name that trips everyone up, I should be far better in getting yours right, Harry. So, Harry Shedler, welcome back, man. You very well received part 1 that you and I put out there. Hoping that y'all will enjoy part 2 as well. As a refresher, this is a series where Harry and I are going to go team by team in the NBA, and we are going to compare lists that he and I have put together offline where we project the top 100 players in 9 category leagues for this season. We hit the Hawks through the Cleveland Cavaliers last time. This time we're going to hit the Dallas Mavericks, Denver Nuggets, Detroit Pistons, Warriors, Rockets, and Pacers. It's going to be a good one, Harry. I know that we compared our list offline a little bit before we hopped on here, and we have some interesting disagreements. So I hope you're ready to go to war. I am too. We will. This should be a fun time. So yeah. By the way, hoopball.com presents this show, presents all stuff on the Hoopball YouTube channel. You probably could have figured that one out. If you're new to the channel, drop a like on the video and subscribe. We are going to be rolling with stuff like this all off season and into the regular season as well. So how you feeling, Harry? You ready to dive into our first team here?
Yeah, let's get to it.
All right, get to it we will. First team on the docket today, the Dallas Mavericks. The Mavericks, of course, one of the greatest offensive teams that we have ever seen. Yet Harry and I only have 3 players in the top 109 cat leagues, 2 of which are similar, and we have a little disagreements on our third. You can see I went with Luka, Kristaps Porzingis, and Tim Hardaway Jr. Harry, you went with Luka, Kristaps, and Dwight Powell. So there is, this is a really tough team to project for, because there's a lot of guys who are close to that top 100 range but might not necessarily crack it. But this is a really efficient and high-powered offense, even with new head coach Jason Kidd, presumably. So Harry, walk us through, how did you wind up with Powell here, and what other names were you considering for this spot, if not him?
So with Powell, I was definitely considering the fact that there's not a lot of true big-time rebounders on this team, plus the field goal percentage aspect of just being fed by Luka, where I see it in the realm of possibility that he could potentially get 8 to 12 points a game with 8 or 9 rebounds a game on 48 to 52 field goal percentage. I'm with a block a game too, so I'm thinking that's potentially worth the top 100 player right there. But with your point about having Tim Hardaway Jr., I do definitely think he has a shot up there. But as I build out my fantasy teams, usually I definitely go a little bit more conservative with the field goal percentage. So that's why I put him in the top 100.
And that's a fair point. I mean, the reason I went with Tim Hardaway Jr. is because he got paid this offseason. It seems like Dallas is pretty set on him just being the full-time shooting guard in that starting lineup, and there was some hesitancy to put him into that role in his time there. I mean, Josh Richardson started the year last year at that spot. Now he's swapped out. Reggie Bullock and Sterling Brown have been swapped in, but given the money and just the experience on the team, Hardaway figures to take on that role. And when you just isolate his numbers as a starter last season in about 32 minutes per game, he's averaging about 19 points, over 3 threes per game. The field goal percentage is very erratic, like you mentioned. It was about 45% on 14.5 shots per game, which isn't terrible, but not great.
Yeah.
But really, it's those points, threes. He also only averages 1 turnover per game, which gives him a little bit of a boost in 9 category leagues. And that all those numbers combined, that puts him just outside the top 100 range. So by putting him here, I'm projecting that he maybe bumps the efficiency up a little bit. Maybe we see him get more attempts at the free throw line because he's a good shooter there. But I just feel that he is the only other guy on this team that has a guaranteed role on offense. But the center rotation is tough because I agree with you. There's totally an avenue for there to be a valuable player on that team, but there's just been so much inconsistency at that center rotation based on, with Powell being injured. Kleba has given a lot of time there, and he's had some successful stints. but he fought through COVID and injury last year, and it just didn't pan out. So I'm not sure if he's the
Right.
option. But then there's another interesting name in town that was very popular in fantasy circles for a good few weeks last year, Moses Brown, acquired by the Mavericks in a series of different swaps. I mean, I think he was traded to 4 different teams this offseason before he wound up in Dallas. But, I mean, what do you feel about Moses Brown this year? I mean, there's a deep rotation at center there. Do you feel that he has the chops to play, I don't know, like a 24-minute role per game there? And if he does, do you think that's a top 100 viable player?
I do not at this moment in time. I think he found a perfect place in Oklahoma City last year where they shut down Al Horford completely, and he was just able to dominate the center rotation. And for everyone, including myself, who had him for that good 4-week period around like late February to mid-March, it was amazing. But then watching a few of his games, he seems to lack energy after a little bit. His defensive rotations are a little late. So if I'm Coach Kidd there, I don't know how he isn't the fourth center off the bench behind Bojan Marjanovic.
Right. Yeah, Marjanovic is there too. Willie Cauley-Stein's there too. Another name that we haven't mentioned. I mean, these guys have right. Dallas is obviously still figuring out this center spot. They're not satisfied with, just Powell and Kleba. And, there's Porzingis should be discussed just a little bit too. Not because I don't think that there's any real debate about him being a top 100 player. I think on a per game basis, no matter how many games he plays, he's probably going to get you there. I mean, but how do you feel just in general? I mean, he's coming into the season injury-free. He's healthy, which is usually a really good sign. Where would you want to draft Kristaps in a head-to-head league? I mean, there's clearly he's always going to have an injury concern associated with him just because of how many times he's been dinged up. The knee injuries in particular are very concerning for a guy his size. I mean, but given the fact that he's healthy coming into drafts this year, where would you be comfortable taking him? And do you think that there's, an avenue that he could be a steal if he stays healthy?
So this is assuming that I want to draft him. Because I usually try to stick away from injury-prone players like Porzingis.
Very fair.
But if I could get him around the 4th, and if you got lucky, the 5th round, like you definitely get some really good value. I'd be hesitant to take him any earlier than the 4th. And given how the Yahoo mock drafts are looking, Capella's going a little late currently. I would much rather get Capella or Miles Turner, who we'll be talking about later. Someone like that who's a little bit more consistent via the time they spend on the floor versus Porzingis. But if you get him in the 4th, I think that's solid.
I think that's also fair too. I mean, again, much better target in roto leagues where, particularly in a games capped format where you don't have to worry about these injury concerns. But yeah, he's going to be a very polarizing name depending on your draft format. But either way, I think it's fair that you and I both have him as a top 100 lock just for the games that he will play. So that is the Mavs wrapped up. We'll go to our next team. This is a team that you and I both are in agreement. There are only 2 players that we see cracking the top 109 cat leagues. This is the lowest total for any team that we've talked about thus far, which is it's interesting. It's the Nuggets, Nikola Jokic, and Michael Porter Jr. Of course, this team is going to be without Jamal Murray this season, likely going to be splitting that point guard spot between Monte Morris and Facundo Campazzo. So I'll start with this. There's a lot of usage obviously up for grabs without Murray around, and I think you and I both agree that a considerable amount's likely going to go to MPJ. But even amongst the players that, the other players that it could spread out to, none of them really just have the stat set or are just, at a stage of their career where they can't utilize that usage to the same degree that they were able to maybe get to that top 100 range. So some of the names that come to mind that we left out, Will Barton, who looked like he lost a step a little bit last year. Of course, he battled a lot of injuries, started off the year hurt, I believe, with an ankle issue. I mean, he figures to be this team's starting shooting guard this year. He's the one guy that I was closest to including on this list, but I just have questions about his health and what, and just, I mean, whether or not there is just enough stuff there to set him apart from some of these other guys. Because, Barton, he can give you some points, threes, and some nice rebounds from a guard-eligible spot. But, elsewhere, it's just I'm not quite sure if he makes it. I mean, what are your thoughts on Barton, and what other Nuggets players were you considering, or maybe not even considering at all for this last spot?
So, yeah, I think Barton is a decent choice because you get a guy who decent athlete and can also hit the three. So, just off of pure basketball experience, he should have the opportunity to potentially crack the top 100. I don't know if that'll happen, but as far as anyone else, I would consider Aaron Gordon if he decides to just level up to something we haven't seen. Obviously, during his time in Orlando, his best ability or best fantasy output was when he was actually handling the ball and actually running the offense, like a Draymond Green. But when you have Jokic there, you don't necessarily need that. So I think you are right with Will Barton being the next up if he can crack that 90 to 95 range. I don't see anything much more than that.
And as a refresher on Barton and the 2019-2020 season, he was 66th in 9 category leagues with averages of 15 points, about 2 threes per game, 6 rebounds, 3.5 assists, and a steal. Like, those are really solid numbers. And perhaps there's avenues for him to also be a little bit of a secondary playmaker this season, although you do have options with Morris, Campazzo, and Aaron Gordon, like you mentioned, that could take some of those touches away from him. So a lot of it will come down to, whether or not he can get to that 15 and 2 range again with the scoring numbers, and whether or not he can get over a steal per game, which he also did in that season. Total agreement with Aaron Gordon. He is just not a non-category player. He never has been. In Denver, he's proven to just be less of one. His role there is, again, to just be a defender first and sort of a connector on offense. The defense does not translate to steals or blocks. The percentages are whack. The turnovers are still high for him. I mean, there's just not enough there in a 9-category league to want to take him in really any scenario. I mean, he's going in the top 120 in Yahoo mock drafts right now, and there's just a ton of options I prefer. It's also worth noting, too, it kind of goes against the grain on how this stuff works sometimes, where, you have a high-usage point guard go down. Typically, his backup, picks up a lot of that slack, and just by virtue of opportunity alone, get to that top 100 range. But you and I don't feel that Morris or Campazzo has, what it takes to really get there. I mean, we've seen Morris as a starter as opposed to when he's a bench player, and he's another one of those guys who, seems like a per-minute beast, but then plateaus once he hits a certain point. He just doesn't. Still a really low turnover guard. That's really good on his percentages. Those are his calling cards. But he doesn't get enough assists or threes or defensive stats to really elevate him to that range. Frankly, his backup, Campazzo, is a better suited fantasy player. He's much better at collecting assists and steals, those categories that really help him jump in the rankings. Do you feel that either of those two have an outside shot at top 100 this year, or are you sort of on the same page with me where you just don't really see it enough minutes or the stat set in Morris's case to make it there?
So I guess Morris should have a case for it. If Jamal Murray is able to succeed with pretty much Jokic being the primary point guard on the team at the center position, Morris should be able to hypothetically elevate his game, especially given a whole offseason, training camp, if he has the starting point guard job. But other than that, I think you hit the nail on the head where if there's one person outside of Will Barton that could potentially crack the top 100, it is Campazzo. He is like TJ McConnell light from the assists and steals category, where there will be some games where he gets 13 assists and then it'll go down to 2 or 3 so averages work out like where it's like 6 6 if he's actually playing, but we'll see. It'll really come down to Jokic and Porter Jr. just dominating everything.
Yeah, I think those two. Obviously, Jokic is going number 1 in pretty much every draft regardless of format. So Not much of a debate around there. I don't think we need to walk you guys through that one anymore. So we will move on to our third team on the docket, the Detroit Pistons. This is a fun team right here. A lot of interesting names, some nice disagreement between you and I here as well. We both have Cade Cunningham, we both have Isaiah Stewart, and we both have Saddiq Bey as top 100 players this year. But I only have Kelly Olynyk as another guy who will get there, a backup center, where you have Jeremy Grant and Killian Hayes. So you have the full starting five of the Pistons. Now, in terms of controversial takes here, I'll take, I believe I'm the one with it here. I don't have Jeremy Grant. He's probably, debatably one of the first Pistons coming off the board. If not him, then Cade Cunningham. And, I'll go ahead and just give my explanation. I just think that, look, Grant surprised a ton of us last year. He is clearly more capable of being a number one option than we gave him credit for when he was first signed in Detroit. Had an absolutely awesome start to the year where he's putting up top 30 numbers, but that usage wore on him. And so much of what he did to succeed cratered once we got towards the latter half of the season. I mean, his percentages were down to 41%. The free throw percent shooting, which he averaged 84 on the season from the line on really high volume, like about 6 attempts per game. We never saw that out of him. That fell closer down to 78% at a higher volume, which went from being a plus to still a plus in that category, but I still feel that there's kind of an aberration there. The defensive stats dried up for him just because he was so dominant it's so heavy usage on the offensive end. The defense, the rebounding numbers were really low. So, for me, I just look at that second half of the season, and I feel that if he is still going at this crazy high usage rate, he's going to be cratering your percentages in a way that won't be able to be made up from the fact that he can get you 20 points and he can get you a blocked shot per game. I just feel that there's so much variance there, and maybe he could get he had put up a top 110 season. It wouldn't surprise me. And you could argue, too, that him having more options around him, like Saddiq Bey and Stewart starting full-time, Killian Hayes running the point, and, of course, Cade Cunningham probably leading this team in shot attempts, if not second to Grant this season. Maybe there's an argument that in a secondary or tertiary role, those percentages come back up and he's still giving you enough to justify that spot. But I just think he relies too much on usage. And a lot of what we saw last year, I'm of the opinion that it's not replicable heading into this year. Not to mention that I do think that Kelly Olynyk will be playing at the 4. He'll be backing up Stewart, but there'll be times where he'll be playing next to Stewart too as a 4 and a 5. And I think that has a way of cutting into Grant's minutes overall as well, because I think that Olynyk, his floor spacing ability in this offense will really – it'll be a plus. I think it'll be more of a plus than what Grant can provide necessarily in some instances. And Olynyk's just a per-minute monster. I think that he'll just barely make the cut, but I just think that it's just one of those things in fantasy where you have a really high usage guy who will put up numbers, but he will kill you in so many other areas along the way. So that's my argument for without Grant. But again, there's a lot of disagreement, I'm sure, about that. Why did you include Grant? And also talk to me a little bit about Killian Hayes, who you put up here.
So you've actually kind of convinced me against Grant. So congratulations. As you were discussing him, the more I kept thinking about it, especially because I think Killian Hayes is going to get a decent amount of usage this year. Obviously, Cade Cunningham is. Will there be opportunities for Grant that he had last year? If anything, he's the third banana now, just because Killian Hayes needs the ball to be effective. Cade, he might be able to be secondary, but as the number 1 overall pick, and he's going to have the ball. I think you just talked me out of Jeremy Grant. He has bust potential, especially going late 70s, early 80s.
Again, you could maybe chalk up a lot of what was going on with him to fatigue last year because he was carrying a pretty heavy burden. There's plenty of arguments that you can make that this is a too extreme to bump him all the way down there. But I mean, look, he was outside the top 200 players the last 2 months of the season. That can't just be written off as just saying he was just tired. I mean, there are statistical holes.
Yeah, there were, and there was a lot of rest days too. During that time.
Possibly.
So I do, yeah, potentially checked out. I think you bring up a good point though, where he just has bust potential due to his usage, and you're getting a whole other year from these young guys like Killian and Isaiah Stewart and Sadiq Bey, who they were really riding at the end of the season, and obviously Cade coming in. So we can scratch him off mine.
We'll scratch him off yours. We each get one take back, and I said because I probably have one on the list coming up later in the show that I would like to take back myself. So we'll take him off for you in our final tally. But let's talk a little bit about the Pistons that we did include. In particular, right. I mean, like Cade. Rookies are really hard to project, but Cunningham to me looks like he's just got so much variety to the stats that he can accumulate as just like he can score, he can get assists, rebounds, probably get you over a steal per game. The percentages might be a little bit of a concern this year, but I think we both anticipate that he can, that he can make the cut maybe in the top 80 range. But let's talk a little bit about Stewart and Sadiq Bey. They're two really impressive rookies from last year who played most of the year. Both got opportunities to elevate to the starting lineup for certain junctures, and now both figure to have those spots long term. Now, obviously, Dwayne Casey is a pretty notoriously difficult coach for fantasy managers. He is someone who loves to, their minutes and consistency is not his game. He loves Corey Joseph. Mm-hmm. He loved Mason Plumlee last year. I'm sure he'll love Kelly Olynyk this year, part of why I've included him in my list, because I think that he's just going to get more opportunities than I think we will expect to go out there and, be a sort of offensive safety net for these rookies and second-year guys. But so what do you like about Stewart and Bey this year?
So Stewart's one of my favorite fantasy choices for all drafting purposes. He was a per-minute monster last year, and I think he has potentially top 50 upside. So out of everyone on my list, excluding Jeremy Grant now, I think he'll have the highest potential. Just because I like you were mentioning, okay, I don't trust rookies. As far as Sadiq Bey goes, he really came on at the end of last year, especially with his 3-point shooting. Percentages were solid, and lengthy defender. So I think he could crack like 75 to 100. Not as excited about him as I am Stewart, but I think he has that with him. The big thing with this Detroit team, outside of Stewart, Bey, and most likely Kelly Olynyk, I think we should just expect poor field goal percentage from Cunningham, Grant, and Killian Hayes as the ones we have listed.
Yeah, I like Stewart too. I've definitely talked about him a good amount on the channel. He is someone who, the hype is definitely starting to catch up. He's risen through the ranks. Yeah, like Yahoo's recent ranking update, I'm pretty sure that they have him now in the 70s range. He was going around, I think they had him closer to the 90s before. So it's starting to catch up. I wouldn't like to draft him any earlier than the 70s because you're really losing a lot of opportunity for a value there. But he does have the highest upside of all these guys. I totally agree with that. Just as a really high field goal percentage guy, good shot blocker, good rebounder. He showed some potential to improve his touch both at the free throw line, and he even got a little bit of three-pointers up last year. I don't think that'll be an element.
He was a little, he was a little ballsy towards the end last year.
They let him do it. And look, the form didn't look awful. I mean, it's just, I'm not expecting that to be an element of his game, but he just strikes me as a guy who has upside that some of these other guys just won't be able to touch this year. So I think that no matter how many minutes he ends up playing, whether if he's in a straight timeshare with Olynyk, which I'm hoping is not the case, but even in about 24 minutes, I think he makes this list. Whereas Sadiq Bey, he definitely came on towards the end of last year. When you isolate his numbers as a starter, they're pretty appealing stuff, like about 14 points per game, 2.7 threes, close to a steal per game, some nice rebounding numbers, really low turnovers. Those numbers as a starter, when you just sort of compare them to where guys are ranked comparably, he's about a top 115 player in 9 category leagues. And that's despite the fact that he shot below 40% from the floor. So if you have any expectation that he can get that 40% to maybe 43, we're not even asking for a whole lot there, but on about the same 13 shots to 12 shots per game, I think that could be enough to move him up to the top 100. So he is someone that I think is a really solid pick after the first 100 picks. You could probably get him at 120 to 130 range. He is someone that I think could definitely take that next step this year. He's got a fan. I love watching this Pistons team play, man. Like they're going to be really fun to watch, even if they're not going to be all that good.
Right. I'm hoping they make the play-in tournament. They're exciting.
It remains to be seen. So that is the wrap there on the Pistons. Let's go ahead and move on to our next team on this list, the Golden State Warriors. Another list where there's not a whole lot of disagreement between you and I. We both have Steph and Draymond, and I included Andrew Wiggins. And look, Wiggins is, he's not someone who is going to break through the rankings in some way where I think he's going to be a top 90-ish guy just because he's a solid source of points and he can give you some blocks at the guard position, which is pretty valuable just for one of those interesting out of position stat guys. But he has solidified himself as an important piece of what Golden State does. He's a really good defender for them. He's going to continue to see a lot of touches in this offense. I think what's a more interesting conversation about this Warriors team is the guys that we didn't include. And really, we're one name in particular that he's going to get overdrafted this year in my mind, and that's Klay Thompson, returning after a 2-year absence with multiple different knee injuries. Klay at the moment is getting drafted. Yahoo has him ranked just outside the top 100 in their rankings board. He has been getting drafted well before that, though, because they had him in like the 70s range for some reason. Talk to me about why you did not include Klay on your list, and I'll also give my thoughts on him as well.
So the biggest thing, it has to do with the reporting. There hasn't been any news other than they're expecting him to return in December. So we're going to be missing a good month and a half of value. And then on top of that, how many days is he going to rest a week? Like, is he going to rest all the back-to-backs? It really just comes down to that. As much as Klay Thompson has been an Iron Man in the past, if I'm the Golden State Warriors organization, like, I'm definitely taking my time with him. And for fantasy, that's not good. So could he finish in the top 120? Like all of a sudden just turns it on, like they take all the restrictions off of him after a month or two, maybe. But the earliest I would take him would be the last round as a flyer, and then put him on the bench and see if something happens.
I agree. He is just someone that I'd much prefer to take a dart throw at than make him a part of my team. It's a critical piece of my roster construction, which is if he's going in the 70s and 80s, that's the kind of guy that you're not supposed to drop, early on in the season.
Right.
It shouldn't be what your goal is. But you know what the rule is, or my rule and several other people's rule, just you never draft guys who aren't healthy to start the season. And he won't be. There's obviously a ton of baggage with the nature of his injuries, how long he's missed, his age, and just the context that the Warriors need him at his best for the playoffs. And, there's just no scenario that I can see where he's going to be playing at a level consistent enough and reliable enough to get to that top 40 kind of range that we saw him in the past couple of years before the injury. I mean, you're asking, if your expectations that Klay comes back and he's averaging 20 a game with 3 threes, getting you a steal still 48% from the floor, on high volume, like it's just not gonna. That's just unreasonable. There's gonna. I mean, and I know full well what I'm saying. Klay's one of the greatest shooters to ever play the game, and I'm not taking any of that away from him. But this is just not going to be the season for him in terms of fantasy. There's just not enough. I can't imagine that they're going to play him an allotment of minutes that would be impactful. He's going to get rest days, like you indicated. He's going to have to shake off some rust. And then there's also concerns about his long-term, these injuries, they are, what impact does that have on his ability to be an elite defender like we saw in the past?
Right.
It's not like he was averaging a steal and a half per game, but that one steal that he was getting, like 1.1 or something, that is another source of fantasy value that sets him apart from a lot of these other guys. Is he still quick enough to be able to get that number for you again? I mean, there's a ton of questions, and really you're doing yourself a disservice by trying to answer them after you've taken him before these top 100 picks. I agree with Harry that if you want to take a stab at him, you do that with your last pick in the draft. The other guy I just wanted to touch on real quick here, who I think is actually, and there's a couple of interesting players too on this bench that have some fantasy upside. Like we can talk about Otto Porter Jr. coming here in the reserve role. We all know what kind of fantasy player he used to be on a per minute basis. He's just battled so many injuries that it's kind of unclear what his role is going to be on this team. Juan Toscano-Anderson impressed as well last year as this sort of Nick Batum-like do-it-all forward who can get you boards and assists and steals, and he's definitely going to have a large role to start the season. But one guy that I think could be taking a next step, both in real life and potentially in fantasy this year, is Jordan Poole, third-year guard out of Michigan. He really excelled for the Warriors at stretches last year. He filled in was it for Curry? It was for he filled in for someone last season and really took on a ton of usage, and he never let it go. It just what do you make of those three players? Is there anyone there that you think could break through and maybe be a sneaky top 100 guy as well?
So I like you bringing in Otto Porter because he previously was. He pretty much has taken the past 2 years off almost with all the injuries. And also they brought back Andre Iguodala. And as we know within the Golden State system, they love having those big ball handlers to kind of free up or to set up Curry and Jordan Poole, eventually Klay. So there could be some upside as him being the semi-Draymond whenever Draymond's not on the court, where he might be able to get some assists, obviously get some steals, and an open three once in a while. But I think for the more Will Barton comparison, it would be Jordan Poole. Talking about a guy who definitely came on at the end of last year and has that potential to get you solid field goal percentage, three-pointers, and I'm blanking on his defensive stats, but maybe he gets you a steal a game, at least until Klay Thompson comes back. So that's who I'd bet on. The only other person who we know is going to be getting minutes, assuming he's healthy, is James Wiseman. And I think he is a guy that you take during free agency. Don't draft him. See the first 2 weeks, as we know, people surprise us all the time. So he could be one of those surprises, but that'd be the only other person I would throw in the mix there.
Yeah, and I think the last report I read on him is that he might not be ready to start the season.
Right.
He still recovering from the surgery that he had last year. A lot of questions about him, but obviously there is incentive to get him in a good to really just continue to develop him as a former number 2 overall pick and someone that they hope to continue building the franchise around. Jordan Poole is not someone I would draft, and it's really someone that I'd look to maybe add on the waiver wire, particularly in the stretch before Klay returns sometime in Christmas. I think that Poole will be their starter at shooting guard, and his stat set is more akin to Tim Hardaway Jr.'s, but with a little higher assist upside. Doesn't really get you many steals though. Field goal percentage is also a pretty tricky area there, but he is a good free throw shooter. He does have a decent knack at getting to the line. But I think that he's someone that's going to have a pretty big year for that team this year as he continues to develop as just this sort of he might be their 6th man once Klay is back, and maybe he excels in that role too. But yeah, that is it for the Warriors. We have 2 more teams to touch on. Another really interesting one. You and I have a lot of disagreements here, and another, frankly, kind of a bad team, the Houston Rockets, who have gotten a lot of talk in fantasy circles, obviously, since the John Wall news broke about him not playing for Houston this year, freeing up Kevin Porter Jr. to be that team's starting point guard and likely creating a starting role for Jayshawn Tate at small forward. But let's talk. We're going to start with you here because you have the two buzzy names on this Houston team, KPJ and second overall pick Jalen Green as top 100 guys this year. So what do you see in those two, and why did you? Where do you think they'll finish in those top 100 rankings?
So with KPJ, whenever John Wall was not on the court with him, he was producing solid fantasy value. And now, considering John Wall is going to be out for the season, I definitely see, especially if you draft him at like 100, you could probably get value up in the 80s by the end of the season. For this Rockets team, there does need to just be a preface of just expect the worst. You're talking about a bunch of young players who are still trying to get their legs under them. Very similar to Oklahoma City, in my opinion, where outside of Shea, where there will be a lot of turnovers some nights. There will be poor field goal percentage. And so that's what I expect with KPJ. But also, I think the upside is absolutely there where he could potentially turn in a top 80 season. And same with Jalen Green, because I think that he's going to get the usage as a top pick from this year's draft.
Well, I agree that these two are just going to see a ton of usage. And look, the numbers with Kevin Porter Jr. are really appealing in terms of just like when you isolate the games that he started at point guard last year without John Wall, he averaged about 19 points per game, 7.5 assists, which would have been inside the top 10 in NBA averages had he done that over the course of a season. About 2 threes per game, like counting stats monster. But my concern in a 9 category league setting specifically is, once again, this is a guy who has gigantic holes in his percentages, both percentages at that, and the turnovers especially. I mean, look, he's still learning the point guard position. That is not he came into the league as a wing, and most people saw him as that. He sees himself as a point guard, and look, he is a good playmaker, no doubt. But he averaged close to 4 turnovers per game in those 15 or so games that he started at the point without Wall. It's rocky stuff. And if you're in an 8-cat league, I feel much better about his chances to be top 100. But when you factor turnovers in, that is going to make things really tricky. I mean, he was outside the top 200 as a Rocket last year in 9-cat. And in those averages that I just cited, that really bumps him up more to the 170s range. But again, just because he's just such a massive drag on field goal percentage, free throw percentage, and turnovers. And, he doesn't get enough steals or blocks to really offset that. Jalen Green, for me, I didn't include him just because I think that he profiles as just one of those high usage rookies that it's similar to Kevin Porter, will just get you a ton of counting stats, but I don't think that I don't think that he'll get assists to the same degree that KPJ will. I mean, look, the guy looks incredible when you watch him in summer league. I mean, I think there's a lot to say about the numbers that he was able to produce against the G League competition, which is head and shoulders above college level talent. I mean, the G League is comprised of the best of college who just aren't good enough for the league. I mean, he's going to be a fascinating case study to see how we evaluate prospects that go through that system first.
Absolutely.
But I'm really interested to see what he can do. I'm just not sure if there's enough there to be a top 100 guy. It would require his percentages to not be abysmal, at least the field goal percentage. I think that he's going to need to get involved in getting some steals for you as well, and maybe limit his turnovers. Look, it's Yahoo is actually, to my surprise, they're not blowing his ADP out of the water. They have him ranked outside the top 100 right now. There seems to be some agreement there that there's some risks with Jalen Green, despite all the real life hype, the eye test. When you watch this kid play, he's amazing. It might take a year or two. Think Trey and Luka. Definitely not the same stat set as those guys, but high usage players that are figuring out the NBA and may have some growing pains in their rookie year. So that's my perspective there. As far as the other guys that we included, Christian Wood doesn't require much analysis. I think he could be in for a pretty big season, in fact, if he's playing full time. But we both included Jayshawn Tate. I project him to be the starting small forward, or at least playing a role in the high 20s. Versatile Swiss Army knife type of player who can get you a steal and a half per game. who could get involved in the playmaking game as well, get you some threes. He really high field goal percentage. He just brings a lot to the table, and I think that he might be the second best player in terms of 9-cat fantasy value on this team. And I also included Daniel Tice, who I think the Rockets brought in to at least be the starting center. Yeah, I just think that, and I might be blowing it a little too much out of the water to have Tice here. Maybe 120 range is more appropriate. But I just like this notion that Tice is going to come in and be this defensive presence for this team that doesn't have a lot down low, that he will start over Alperen Sengun, who's a very highly rated and highly touted rookie prospect who I just don't think will get the opportunity off the bat. I think that Tice is just in an opportunity where, we've seen him in multiple stops now with the Bulls and the Celtics. So if you give him over 24 minutes a game, he's a really decent percentages guy, can get you over a block per game, can space the floor a little bit too. I think that he will play enough minutes, at least to start the season, to be a sneaky top 100 guy. I don't know. Maybe, do you see that? And the fit with Wood might be a little questionable too. Wood maybe makes more sense as a full-time 5, but I think that they're going to play him at the 4 a good bit of the season. And, there'll be some mixing and matching here, but I can't really rationalize them bringing in Daniel Tice and then not starting him off the bat. I think that he provides value, again, as an interior defender, but also on the offensive end, he can help Jalen Green and Kevin Porter Jr. as a solid screener, as a solid roll man or pick and pop. He can do either. I think that they want him out there for this season. What are your impressions?
Gotcha.
There?
So my concern with Tice, and I have this very similar concern with Christian Wood, but to a lesser extent, is that he may start, as you say, and he puts up great stats for fantasy, but I see come March or maybe even earlier in February him getting shut down and just rolling with the young bucks and getting them all the reps possible prior to the offseason. Have a little bit of fear that happening with Christian Wood as well, but due to his talent, less so.
And look, that's a totally fair point about Tice. I think that he makes a lot more sense in a roto league because you can just take those games early on in the season and just run to the bank with them all the way through. Whereas if you're in a playoff setting, there's a really good, you're totally right that there's plenty of scenarios in where he's not in that starting lineup anymore. And the Rockets are they're competing for the number 1 pick more so than anything else. So they're going to pivot to youth.
Right.
And look, you've got Tice on your team. Then Sengun profiles as a really intriguing fantasy prospect. Maybe you can find a way to swap those two out right when that switch starts to take place. So the totally fair argument. Maybe once it's all said and done too, once Tice is relegated to more of a reserve role, he isn't top 100 on the totality of the season. But I really do think that in the early half that he is going to be a valuable player. So at least in 9-cat leagues. So we will have to see about that. We have one more team to touch on today, the Indiana Pacers. And remember earlier on, you said you'd take Jeremy Grant back. I will claim a take back here. I unfortunately made the graphic and changed my mind after I made enough time to edit it. I would have my list the same as yours. I included Karis LeVert, despite how well he played for the Pacers last year. I think that there's a better chance he doesn't make the top 100 this year, just in a world where this Pacers team is fully healthy. LeVert, after making his debut for the Pacers in mid-March, had the benefit of not only a ton of injuries throughout the roster, where he was the one mainstay, and he was fantastic. He posted top 70 numbers on the season. And he led the team in shot attempts with about 17 per game. And that number in particular, I feel like, is not sustainable, especially if TJ Warren is able to return to health and actually contribute for this team this year. There's some question marks about that. Had Warren not suffered this foot injury, or not, I guess the update that we got from the Pacers is that he was not progressing how they had hoped, and now we have no idea when he will play. If it were the opposite and we knew that Warren was in this lineup, those two would be, I'd probably have Warren on this list instead of LeVert, because I think that his fantasy stat set is better suited for a team with so many options like this Pacers squad does when they're fully healthy. So I would take LeVert back. Talk to us, though, about the four that you chose. Sabonis is an obvious one. And look, Turner and Malcolm Brogdon, I think most people would agree. But you included TJ McConnell in there, as did I. How do you view these four as top 100 players? What is the argument for all four making it?
Well, so DeMontis is pretty much Jokic light. Like he'll get you the rebounds. He'll get you assists from the center position. Amazing field goal percentage. He'll even hit a three every once in a while. So like probably like a 0.7% of the time or something like that, or 1.7 threes per game. So he's easy. Personally, I stay away from Miles Turner because he is a center who only gets 6 to 8 rebounds a game, and it's not my favorite stat set to build a fantasy team around, even though his blocks are usually on average at 2 blocks a game, which is amazing. And then you have Brogdon.
3 this last season too.
Yes, absolutely. No worries. Yeah, he fluctuates. I think it was 2 seasons ago. And then a little in between of 2 blocks a game. So that seems to be the pattern, which is amazing, and that can literally just win you that category. With Brogdon, we're talking about a point guard who gives you solid field goal percentage, low turnovers, about 5 to 10 assists, depending if Sabonis is going to be up there in the assist category this year, and 1.2, 1.3 threes per game. And then finally with TJ, he's just like the best role player you can have. Low field goal percentage, high field goal percentage, but low shots overall taken. Steals are amazing, and somehow from a role player, bench player last year, gave you minimum of 5 assists. It could have been higher than that, but I'm blanking on the exact total at the moment. But those 4 are just solid. And your point to Karis LeVert, you got a lot of playmakers on this team outside of Miles Turner, who just kind of feeds off of everyone else. So it'll be interesting to see how much usage he gets with this team.
Yeah, I love the McConnell choice too, like because he does not need usage, at least in terms of shot attempts per game, to get up there. I mean, one of the best pickups in all of fantasy hoops last year. He helped me win a league. Shout out to the old Better Call Gasol league from back home. I took home that championship this year. And McConnell, man, he wound up with 6.5 assists per game in a 26-minute role, 1.9 steals, near elite numbers in both categories. And he's just someone I see no reason why Indiana won't roll with him in about 24 minutes again this year. And in that time, he has proven to be an incredibly effective 9-category leagues player. One of the best sources of assists late in a draft, which is a category that gets very scarce the longer you go on. He's definitely someone who I think is going to get slept on just because, he's TJ McConnell. You hear that name, it's just like, oh, he's not an NBA top 100 player. Like, this is TJ McConnell. But make no mistake, Rick Carlisle, his presence there is definitely, it'll be really interesting to see like what kind of systems he implements on the offensive side of the floor and whether or not he believes he wants to maintain that role for McConnell. But that's a much deeper discussion that I'm not qualified to discuss. We need to bring on some Mavs and Pacers people on the show to dig into that a little bit more. But I think it's fair to assume that these 4 guys are going to make the top 100 this year should they all stay healthy. So that's it. That is another 6 teams in the book. We are now 12 down, and we've got 18 more to go. We'll be rolling these out over the next few weeks. Feeling good about your list so far, Harry?
Not bad. I'm a little concerned about Rockets and Pistons. Use a lot of picks right there.
Yeah, I know. I've also gone a lot of picks too. I have a feeling that we're going to come up with – I know there's some teams coming up where, like the Nuggets in this video, we only had 2 top 100 options. I'm anticipating that we'll have more of that. But yeah, quick math so far, I think that we are on pace to break through 100 players for each of our lists. But that'll be really fun once we're done with this series to circle back and see where we wound up there. Maybe we'll have to take some names out. That'll be a fun discussion in and of itself. But Harry, once again, thank you for hopping on. It's always a pleasure talking fantasy hoops with you. We will be back with part 3 very soon, along with some other videos coming up here in the next week or so. That some really interesting strategy-based videos that we're going to be releasing. So check us out, subscribe to the channel, and drop a like on the video if you haven't already. And we will check in with you next time. See you, everyone.